They whispered she was too scarred to ever be a bride, until a rancher silenced their cruelty with a kiss that saw only her worth. But is his love strong enough to heal the wounds the world left behind? The church bell rang at noon, its echo carrying across the small town of Silver Creek. Inside, rows of guests fanned themselves against the late summer heat, whispering behind lace handkerchiefs and stiff collars. Evelyn Carter stood at the altar, her hands clasped tight around a simple bouquet of wildflowers. The white fabric of her gown brushed the floorboards, hiding the way her knees trembled. She had told herself this was her chance to belong, to silence the voices that had called her unwanted for so many years. The veil softened her features, but not enough to conceal the scars that wound across her cheek and down her neck, branching like rivers into the skin of her arms. She felt every pair of eyes on her, measuring her worth. The groom, Walter Crane, shifted at her side. His jaw was set, his gaze sharp, but she thought she saw nerves too. When the pastor's voice rang out, asking Walter if he would take her hand in marriage, a long silence filled the room. Walter cleared his throat, his words breaking like dry wood. "I can't do this." The air left the church in one collective gasp. Evelyn turned toward him, her breath caught in her chest. "What do you mean?" she whispered. He shook his head, backing a step away from her. "I won't wed a scarred bride. I won't bind myself to a woman who'll bring shame to my family." His voice rose, each word like a lash across her skin. "I was a fool to agree in the first place." The whispers turned to laughter, quiet, sharp, cruel. Someone muttered, "Told you she'd be left." Another snickered, "No man wants damaged goods." Evelyn's heart pounded so loudly, she thought it might shatter through her chest. The bouquet slipped from her fingers, petals scattering across the wooden floor. For a moment, she stood frozen, every eye piercing her. Shame burned hotter than any fire she had ever known. And then, she ran. The heavy church doors swung wide as she burst into the sunlight, her veil trailing behind her. Her slippers kicked up dust as she fled down the main street, past wagons and storefronts, past the very people who had gathered to witness her disgrace. She did not stop until the voices faded into the distance, until her lungs ached with every breath. She stumbled to the edge of the creek, falling to her knees in the tall grass. The reflection in the water showed her scars more clearly than any mirror. She hated herself for hoping, for believing that someone might look past the damage. She pressed her hands to her face, choking back a sob. The bells still rang faintly in the distance, marking the hour she was meant to become a wife. Instead, she was alone, broken, and humiliated. She vowed in that moment that she would never again give anyone the power to shatter her. Yet fate had a way of crossing paths in the dust and silence of the prairie, and Evelyn had no idea whose shadow was about to fall across her life. If you've ever seen someone walk away from ashes into destiny, wait until you see who rides into her life next. The sun dipped lower as Evelyn sat by the creek, her gown crumpled and streaked with dirt. The murmur of water did little to ease the storm in her chest. Her whole life had been measured in the pitying glances of neighbors and the scorn of men who could not see past her scars. Now, even the last hope marriage had been stripped from her in front of the entire town. She hugged her knees, the world spinning, until the sound of hooves drew her head up. A lone rider approached from the south, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He rode a dark bay horse with easy control, his broad shoulders straight in the saddle. As he drew nearer, Evelyn recognized him, Caleb Whitaker, the rancher who kept mostly to himself. People in town spoke of him as if he were a ghost of his former self, a man who rarely smiled, who carried grief like a second skin. Caleb reined in his horse a few paces from her, his gaze steady beneath the brim of his hat. For a long moment, he said nothing. Evelyn's first instinct was to shrink back, certain he had come to deliver some new piece of mockery, but his expression held no cruelty. "You shouldn't sit out here alone," he said at last, his voice low and rough from disuse. Evelyn looked away, bitterness curling in her throat. Alone is better than being laughed at. Caleb dismounted slowly, as though approaching a skittish animal. He tied his horse to a low branch and stepped closer, boots crunching against the dry grass. I saw what happened. Her heart sank. She had prayed no one else would follow, but shame had a way of spreading. Then you know I have nothing left, she murmured. His brow furrowed. That's not true. The certainty in his tone startled her, but she could not let herself believe it. She pressed her palms to her dress, willing her voice to steady. Why should you care? You don't even know me. Caleb's gaze flickered, a shadow passing through his eyes. Maybe because I know what it feels like to lose everything. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Evelyn remembered whispers about Caleb's past, how his wife had died suddenly, how he had withdrawn from the world since. He extended a calloused hand toward her. Come, let me take you back to my ranch. It's quiet there. No one will bother you. Evelyn hesitated, staring at his hand as if it were a trick. Trust had always come at a price, and hers had been spent too freely in the past. Yet something about the stillness in his voice, the absence of judgment in his eyes, nudged her trembling fingers forward. She placed her hand in his, surprised by the warmth of his grip. Caleb helped her to her feet. You don't owe me an explanation, he said. Just a chance to rest. And for the first time since fleeing the church, Evelyn felt the faintest spark of safety. Together, they mounted his horse, and under the dimming sky, the rancher carried the scarred bride away from the ruins of her past. The ride to Caleb's ranch was quiet, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves filling the silence. Evelyn sat stiff in the saddle before him, clutching the reins as though they were her only tether. She was aware of the warmth of Caleb's presence at her back, the steady strength that steadied her own trembling. When they crested the last ridge, the ranch stretched before them, rolling pasture land dotted with cattle, a weathered barn, and a 2-story house that bore both care and loneliness in its bones. The shutters were straight, the fences mended, yet the place felt hollow, like a song missing half its notes. Caleb dismounted first, then helped her down with the same care he had offered by the creek. You'll be safe here, he said simply. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold of the house. The door was sturdy oak, the hinges polished from years of use. She wondered how long it had been since anyone but him had stepped through it. But when he opened the door and motioned her inside, she followed. The interior was plain but tidy shelves, lined with books and ledgers, the scent of cedar smoke clinging to the air. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, its hearth swept clean though no fire burned. Everything bore the mark of Caleb's hands, practical, well kept, but lacking softness. You can have the guest room upstairs, he said, removing his hat and setting it on a hook by the door. There's clean linens. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. You don't have to trouble yourself. His eyes flicked to hers, steady and unreadable. It's no trouble. The guest room was small but comfortable, with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Evelyn set her satchel down, little more than a few belongings she had carried from her father's home, and ran her fingers over the stitching of the quilt. For the first time in hours, her pulse began to slow. That evening she came downstairs to find Caleb preparing supper. He moved with practiced ease, slicing bread and ladling stew from a pot simmering on the stove. He glanced at her but made no comment on her scars as the lantern light caught them. Sit, he said, motioning toward the table. Evelyn obeyed, though her hands remained clasped tight in her lap. The stew was hearty, fragrant with herbs, and though she tried to hide it, hunger gnawed at her. She ate quietly, aware of his gaze from across the table. At one point, she spilled a drop of broth on her hand. Reflexively, she pulled back, expecting him to notice, to flinch at the sight of the scarred skin. Instead, Caleb reached for a cloth, dabbing gently at the spill before handing it to her. His touch was practical, unbothered, as if her scars were invisible to him. Something loosened inside her chest. When supper ended, he rose, carrying the dishes to the basin. "You're safe here," he repeated, his tone final, like a promise carved into stone. And for the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to believe it. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains of the guest room, warming Evelyn awake. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the sound of a rooster crowing and the faint clatter of buckets reminded her this wasn't her father's house, nor the church she had fled in disgrace. This was Caleb Whitaker's ranch. She rose and smoothed her wrinkled dress, her eyes catching on the mirror above the washstand. The scars stared back at her, as they always did, mapping her cheek and arm in pale ridges. She almost looked away, but something inside her hardened. If she was to stay here, she could not let shame dictate her every step. Downstairs, she found Caleb already at work, carrying a pail of water in from the well. His shirt sleeves were rolled, forearms taut with the labor of a man used to solitude. He set the pail down and glanced at her, giving a short nod. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep long," she admitted. "I thought, perhaps I could help with the chores." For a moment, he studied her, as if weighing whether she meant it. Then he gestured toward the yard. "The chickens need feeding. Corn's in the sack by the coop." Grateful for the task, Evelyn hurried outside. The hens scattered about her feet, pecking eagerly as she scattered the grain. She found herself smiling at their persistence, and when a young rooster strutted close, she laughed under her breath. It had been a long time since she'd felt even the smallest flicker of joy. When she turned, she caught Caleb watching from the porch. His face was unreadable, but there was no mockery in his eyes, only quiet attention. She ducked her head and continued, determined not to falter. Over the next days, Evelyn made herself useful. She mended a tear in Caleb's work shirt, patched with careful stitches. She swept the porch, tended the small garden that had been overtaken with weeds, and brushed down the horses until their coats shone. Always, she expected him to correct her, to send her away, but Caleb only offered short nods or the occasional word of thanks. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she found herself lingering near the barn, watching Caleb repair a broken fence rail. His movements were steady, precise, his strength obvious in every swing of the hammer. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "May I hold it for you?" she asked softly. He paused, surprise flickering across his face, but handed her the rail. Their hands brushed briefly, rough against scarred, and neither of them pulled away. Together, they steadied the beam until the nail sank deep. When the work was done, Caleb straightened and looked at her fully. "You don't have to prove yourself here," he said. Her throat tightened. "I only don't want to be a burden." His gaze softened, something unspoken passing between them. "You're not." Those two words, simple and steady, cracked something in her armor. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt the faint beginnings of trust taking root. The days slipped into a quiet rhythm on the Whitaker ranch. Evelyn rose with the sun, fed the chickens, and weeded the garden. In the evenings, she and Caleb often shared supper in companionable silence. Yet beneath the calm surface lingered unspoken questions, old griefs that pressed against them like shadows waiting at the edge of the firelight. One night, after a long day of mending fence lines, Caleb built a fire in the stone hearth. The crackle of flames filled the room, but his shoulders carried a weight heavier than his tools. Evelyn sat in the chair opposite him, her hands folded over her lap, gathering courage. "I never thanked you properly," she began, her voice low, "for bringing me here when you had no reason to." Caleb looked up, the firelight cutting across his features. "I reckon everyone deserves a place where they're not hunted by other people's cruelty." Her lips trembled into a half-smile. "That's a rare gift." The warmth of the fire loosened the knots inside her. She had held her story close for so long, fearing the pity it would bring. Yet something about the steady quiet of Caleb's presence made her want to share it. "I was 10 when the fire happened," she said. Her gaze drifted to the flames, memories flickering just as sharp. "Our house caught a lantern tipped in the night. I don't remember much, only heat, smoke, and my father's arms carrying me out. My mother never made it. When I woke, I bore the scars. Folks saw me differently from that day on." Her voice faltered. "Children wouldn't play with me," families whispered. Suitors looked once and turned away. When Walter Crane agreed to marry me, I thought perhaps I could be more than a burden." Caleb's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on his knees. "He was a fool," he said, the roughness in his voice leaving no doubt of his meaning. Evelyn blinked back sudden tears. She had never heard anyone defend her so fiercely. After a long pause, she asked softly, "And you? People say you keep to yourself because of loss." His gaze shifted to the fire, shadows deepening in his eyes. "My wife, Mary," he said finally. "She passed away 5 years ago. Fever took her quick. One day she was laughing in this very room. A week later, she was gone. After that, the ranch became just work. I stopped speaking to most folks, couldn't stand their pity, nor their reminders. The silence between them carried a rawness neither tried to hide. Two souls, scarred in different ways, bound by pain that time had not erased." Caleb's voice broke the stillness. "I blamed myself for not seeing the fever sooner, for not saving her. Same as you carry blame that was never yours." Their eyes met across the fire, and Evelyn felt something stir, recognition, and a kinship that ran deeper than words. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Inside, for the first time, the ghosts of their pasts had been named aloud, and in the naming, the shadows began to lift. The sky turned restless by late afternoon, clouds rolling heavy over the plains. Evelyn stood on the porch, watching the horizon darken, the scent of rain sharp in the wind. She had never liked storms. The crack of thunder always dragged her back to that night long ago, when fire and fear consumed her world. Caleb came up from the barn, his hat pulled low, leading his horse to shelter. "Best get inside," he called. "This one's bound to be rough." She nodded, retreating into the house, but her hands shook as she latched the shutters. By the time the first clap of thunder rattled the walls, Evelyn's heart was pounding too fast. Lightning split the sky, white and blinding, and she flinched as though the flames might leap through the windows at any moment. When the rain came, it pounded in sheets, drumming on the roof, drowning the silence. Evelyn tried to steady her breath, but the memories surged, smoke choking her lungs, heat searing her skin, her mother's voice lost in the crackle of fire. She stumbled into the stable, seeking refuge among the horses, their restless stamping echoing her own panic. Caleb found her there, crouched in the straw, arms wrapped tight around herself. He dropped to one knee beside her. "Evelyn," he said gently, though his voice carried enough firmness to cut through the storm. She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "I can't. Every sound feels like it's happening again. The fire, it's always there." Caleb hesitated only a moment before lowering himself beside her. The lantern light flickered across his face, carved with lines of pain he rarely showed. "The night Mary died," he began slowly, "it stormed just like this. I sat here with the same sound in my ears, wishing I'd done more, hating the world for taking her. You're not the only one haunted when thunder rolls." Evelyn lifted her gaze, startled by the admission. For once, he didn't carry his grief in silence. He laid it bare. The horses shifted restlessly, the storm's roar pressing close. Evelyn's breath hitched, trembling on the edge of panic. Then, softly, she began to hum. The sound was unsteady at first. A broken tune carried on a broken voice. It was the lullaby her mother once sang to her, a melody meant to ward away fear. Caleb stilled, listening. Something in the tune reached him, threading past years of silence. And then, To Evelyn's surprise, he joined her. His voice was low, rough with disuse, but steady. The two notes blended, fragile yet strong enough to carve a calm amid the chaos. The thunder rolled again, but Evelyn no longer flinched. She focused on the harmony between them, the way Caleb's presence steadied her own wavering strength. When the song ended, the storm had not yet passed. But inside the stable, a quiet settled. Caleb reached out, his hand covering hers. "You're not alone anymore," he said. Evelyn held his gaze, her tears easing. For the first time in years, she believed him. The storm passed, leaving the land washed clean. By morning, the ranch shimmered beneath a pale blue sky, puddles glinting like shards of glass across the pasture. Evelyn moved through the chores with lighter steps than usual, the memory of Caleb's voice joining hers lingering like a secret warmth. But peace never lasted long in Silver Creek. Late that afternoon, as Evelyn carried a basket of eggs toward the house, the sound of hooves broke across the quiet. She turned, her stomach tightening as a rider appeared at the crest of the hill. His hat was tilted low, his posture sharp, his horse kicking up dust with every stride. She recognized the cut of his coat, the self-satisfied tilt of his chin, even before the sun revealed his face. Walter Crane. The sight of him at the ranch gates made her blood run cold. Caleb stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression hardened when he saw Walter dismount with arrogant ease. The two men faced each other, silence thick between them. Walter's eyes flicked to Evelyn, then back to Caleb. "So the rumors were true," he drawled. "You've taken in the scarred bride. Tell me, Whitaker, is it pity or desperation that drives you?" Evelyn froze, every insult ringing like it had in the church. But Caleb didn't flinch. He tossed the rag aside and stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "She's under my roof, Crane. That means she's not yours to mock." Walter sneered. "She's a disgrace, Whitaker. You think housing her won't stain your name too? Folks in town are already talking. Best send her packing before you regret it." Caleb's eyes narrowed, the air around him shifting like a storm about to break. "The only thing I regret is that I didn't shut your mouth sooner." His voice rose, cutting through the yard with the weight of finality. "You left her humiliated in front of God and half the county. That says more about you than her scars ever could." Walter's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. He looked at Evelyn, his words sharpened to wound. "You'll never be more than ruined. No rancher, no man worth his salt will ever." "Enough!" Caleb's voice thundered, silencing even the restless horses in the corral. He stepped between Walter and Evelyn, his frame broad and unyielding. "You've had your say. Now leave." For a long, tense moment, Walter's glare flicked from Caleb to Evelyn. He spat in the dirt, swung back into his saddle, and yanked the reins hard. "This isn't over," he hissed before galloping away in a storm of dust. Evelyn stood frozen, her breath trapped in her chest. Caleb turned, his eyes softening when they found hers. "He won't touch you here," he said firmly. Her throat tightened, emotion catching her words. No one had ever stood between her and cruelty before. Caleb had. And in that moment, the ranch no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like home. The encounter with Walter left Evelyn shaken, though she tried to hide it. That night, she lingered by the fire long after supper, staring at the flames as shadows flickered across the walls. Caleb sat across from her, sharpening a knife with steady strokes, the rasp of steel against stone the only sound between them. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "I used to believe my scars were punishment," she said quietly. "That somehow I'd been marked so no one would ever look at me without pity or disgust." Her hands twisted together in her lap. Walter just put words to what I already feared was true. Caleb set the knife down, his gaze fixed on her. "You think that fire ruined you," he said. "But all I see is a woman who survived." Her throat tightened. Surviving isn't the same as living. For a moment, silence stretched, heavy and raw. Then Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. When Mary died, I stopped living too. I buried myself in work, in silence. People whispered that I'd gone cold, but the truth was, I couldn't stand the thought of caring again. It felt safer to live half dead than risk that kind of loss. Evelyn's eyes softened. She had wondered about the loneliness in his voice, the hollow look in his eyes. And now? Caleb hesitated, as though standing at the edge of a precipice. Now you're here. And I find myself wishing for things I thought were gone: laughter in this house, light in these rooms. I look at you and don't see scars. I see strength. I see someone who keeps getting back up when the world tries to break her. Her breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her with such conviction. You don't know how much I want to believe that, she whispered. Caleb rose slowly and crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, lowering himself so his eyes met hers at level. With a gentleness that belied the roughness of his hands, he reached out and brushed his fingers across the ridges of her cheek. Evelyn flinched at first, expecting recoil, expecting disgust, but his touch lingered steady. He bent his head, pressing his lips softly to the scar that had driven others away. Perfect, he murmured, the word carrying the weight of a vow. Her chest ached with the flood of emotions. She had long buried fear, longing, hope, all colliding at once. Tears blurred her vision, but for once, they weren't born of shame. She laid her hand lightly against his arm, grounding herself in the reality of his presence. Why me, Caleb? You could have any woman in town. His answer came without hesitation. Because none of them are you. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the chimney. Evelyn realized then that she wasn't just a guest in his home. She was part of it now, woven into its walls, its quiet, and its promise of a life rebuilt. For the first time, her heart dared to believe she could belong. Word of Evelyn's presence at the Whitaker Ranch spread quickly through Silver Creek, carrying on whispers that drifted through the general store, the saloon, and Sunday gatherings. Some shook their heads in pity, others smirked with cruel delight, and a few wondered aloud why Caleb Whitaker, of all men, would tie himself to damaged goods. Evelyn heard the murmurs when she went to town for supplies one morning. Though Caleb had offered to go to her place, she insisted she was tired of hiding. Still, her steps faltered when she felt eyes follow her from the boardwalk, whispers rising like nettles pricking her skin. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper's wife gave her a strained smile, the kind meant more to ease conscience than to offer kindness. Evelyn held her head high, forcing herself to ignore the sting. But as she turned, she heard a voice sharp and mocking. Well, if it isn't the bride left at the altar, a woman drawled, arms folded across her chest. Guess she's found a man desperate enough after all. Laughter rippled through the store. Evelyn's hands shook as she gripped the sack of flour against her chest. Shame threatened to root her to the spot until the door swung open. Caleb's boots struck the floorboards with steady rhythm as he entered. He took one look at Evelyn's pale face and then at the cluster of townsfolk. His jaw hardened. She's with me, he said, his voice carrying across the room like a hammer on an anvil. And I'll not hear another word against her. The laughter died. Caleb moved to Evelyn's side, taking the flour from her trembling hands and setting it on the counter. He didn't just stand near her, he stood with her, shoulders squared, gaze unflinching. She's worth 10 of any coward who hides behind gossip, he continued, his tone hard enough to leave no doubt. If anyone here thinks otherwise, they can speak to me directly. No one did. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the creak of the floor as Caleb paid for their goods. Evelyn felt his hand brush hers, grounding her, steadying the tremor inside her chest. As they stepped back into the sunlight, Evelyn drew a deep breath, the air sharp with autumn's edge. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Yes, I did, Caleb replied. His eyes softened when he looked at her. You've carried enough alone. You shouldn't have to anymore. Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them back. For years, she had let fear dictate her steps, shrinking from every cruel glance. Now, standing in the open street beside Caleb, she felt something shift. She laced her fingers through his, ignoring the stares that followed. "Then let them see," she whispered. Caleb squeezed her hand, pride flickering in his smile. Together, they walked down the street, not as a broken woman and a grieving man, but as two souls who had chosen love over fear. And in that choice, Evelyn knew she had finally claimed her place in the world. Autumn deepened across Silver Creek, the air crisp with the promise of winter. At the Whitaker Ranch, the days were no longer hollow or silent. The once weary house hummed with life again, Evelyn's laughter echoing through its rooms, Caleb's steady voice returning after years of near silence, and the sound of two people learning how to live beyond the weight of sorrow. One morning, Evelyn stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She watched Caleb drive a wagon-load of hay across the pasture, his figure strong against the golden fields. For so long, she had believed her life would be defined by scars and whispers. Now, she felt rooted here, as much a part of this land as the cottonwoods lining the creek. Caleb joined her on the porch later, brushing hay from his sleeves. He paused, studying her with that steady gaze she had come to know so well. "You've changed this place," he said simply. Evelyn tilted her head. "The ranch was always strong. I just helped sweep out the cobwebs." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, you brought back something I thought was gone for good." The warmth in his tone left her heart full. She set her cup down, her fingers brushing against his. "And you gave me something I never thought I'd have a home." That evening, the town gathered for a harvest supper on the green. Lanterns swung from poles, music spilled from a fiddle, and neighbors carried dishes brimming with food. Evelyn hesitated at the edge of the crowd, the old fear stirring, as curious eyes turned her way. But Caleb's hand found hers, his thumb brushing reassurance over her knuckles. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said quietly. Drawing a breath, she let him lead her forward. Conversations paused as they stepped into the lamplight. For a moment, the hush pressed heavy, but then, as if a dam had broken, people offered nods, smiles, even greetings. Caleb's unwavering pride in her presence left no room for ridicule. He held her hand openly, showing the town that Evelyn Carter was no longer to be pitied, but to be respected. Near the end of the evening, when the fiddler struck up a slower tune, Caleb surprised her by drawing her close. She laughed nervously, her hands resting against his shoulders. "I don't dance," she whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted, guiding her into the rhythm. "But I reckon we can learn together." They swayed under the lantern glow, the music carrying them in gentle circles. Evelyn leaned into him, the world narrowing to the strength of his arms and the steady beat of his heart. Later, back at the ranch, Caleb stood with her on the porch, stars blanketing the wide sky. He took her hands in his. "Evelyn," he said, voice low but sure, "you're not here because I pitied you. You're here because I love you, scars and all, and I can't imagine this place or my life without you." Tears glistened in her eyes as she whispered, "And I love you. You've made me whole again." His lips found hers, gentle yet certain, sealing the promise of all they had endured. Beneath the endless sky, Evelyn knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life she had once believed impossible. If you thought this love story was powerful, wait until you hear the next tale where hearts heal in ways you'd never expect.